don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this episode, I spoke with Karen Foley, who is the president of JPA Chicago. JPA Chicago is a nonprofit that supports school mental health, and it's no secret that young people are experiencing some serious mental health issues. Some would call that a crisis. Among the things that we discussed are the reasons for this mental health crisis and some of the ways that we can respond, some of the criticisms and concerns that some have about teachers working with students in an SEL capacity, and some of the things that I think are pertinent issues in terms of mental health for students. As a reminder, if you're interested in our professional development work, I encourage you to go to our website, which is wegrowteachers.com. And as always, if you have questions, comments, concerns, or ideas for future guests or topics, please feel free to email me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. And now here's that conversation with Karen. I am with Karen Foley, who is going to talk with us about JPA Chicago and student health and mental health and emotional health and all those kinds of things. But as I usually like to do, she's the president of JPA Chicago, but she's going to give herself or give us a better introduction and talk a bit about herself and tell us the relevant details and all that stuff. So welcome, Karen. And now's your chance to let everyone know who you are and what you do and all those good things.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Drew. So happy to be with you today. JPA stands for Juvenile Protective Association. It's an old-fashioned sounding name. We were formed by Jane Addams in 1901, which is kind of cool because I remember reading biographies of her, and today I'm leading an agency that she helped create. And it's always been focused on children and families, and we still are 123 years later.
Okay. And what's your background? Sometimes I even ask, I don't know how much we're going to talk about pedagogy, but sometimes when especially we're talking about pedagogy, I find it interesting and maybe a contextual sort of background knowledge builder to get a sense of what your educational experience was like and maybe previous experience before becoming the president of JPA Chicago.
Sure. Well, I grew up wanting to go into business, and that's what I did. I moved to New York City from Syracuse, New York, when I was very young after college, and went to work in the insurance and finance area, and went on to earn my MBA. So I'm a finance person by training. Okay. And while I was there, the last corporate job I held, I was the chief marketing officer of a $60 billion insurance company, working all around the world. And learned a lot about people and learned a lot about messaging and the importance of teamwork. We won quite a few awards for what we called CNA Talk, which was an initiative that dealt with culture of the company. And one of the things that reported to me in my portfolio was our not-for-profit foundation. And I always loved the work that I was doing in finance, but I found myself being drawn back and back and back to the not-for-profit side of what we were doing. I loved being with the kids. We built a lot of playgrounds called Kaboom with the Kaboom organization, because playgrounds are one of the first places where kids learned how to interact with people who are not in their family and who may be different from them. And those are community centers. And that all seemed to shape up pretty well for me. And I stepped out to take care of our son who was struggling in school. And a lot of the experiences that I had as a parent are very relevant to the work that I do today, because I recognize that teachers do not get much in-depth mental health, social emotional development. I don't like the word learning. It's too cognitive for me. I think that capacity building takes time, and it's a lifelong pursuit. And so we can talk about that a little bit too. But my background is that, and I've been in the not-for-profit space for 20 some odd years now, working with students. And we can talk about how my work in a college to career program, working with very bright kids from under-resourced neighborhoods, where the top issue that they talked to me about behind closed doors, locked doors, and psych wards, park benches, restaurants, was their mental health, not their finance.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll get into some of those things, but let's talk specifically about JPA Chicago, and how do you sort of describe the work that JPA Chicago does, and maybe sort of mission and vision and those kinds of things?
Sure. Well, we believe that there's a bright, valuable adult inside every child, and what they need is the kind of support and opportunities and access to opportunities. And so our whole mission is to help improve the social emotional well-being and functioning of children and the adults who care for them. And we do that primarily in school settings. We've been largely in elementary schools, but just last week we started working with a university in Chicago that actually produces the largest number of teachers that go into the Chicago Public School District. So our work in mental health is really expanded. We provide individual therapy and also a program that we call Connect to Kids. And that is a program specifically designed for educators. And we have some clinics, and we have a research and development department. So we're pretty active, and we're all throughout the Chicago environment.
Okay, and you mentioned working with the university, but obviously you mentioned Chicago Public, which is a massive, massive district. We've worked with Chicago Public Schools doing project-based learning work, and I think some other things as well. Do you work in non-public K-12 settings as well?
Mm-hmm. We're ecumenical charter schools. We are not working currently in any Catholic schools, but we have in the past. So we're really interested in the culture of the school, the educators, and the well-being of the kids. So wherever they happen to land, that's where we will go.
Okay. Well, so many sort of threads we could pull on here. Maybe one of them that is a good starting point is you sort of mentioned the social emotional, you said development, not learning. I doubt that it's a secret to you that SEL or social emotional stuff has become a bit of a flashpoint and a trigger, and I'm sure there's more incendiary ways to describe that, a fodder for the culture wars and that kind of thing. And I'm curious how you think about that. I'm assuming you're an advocate for it, as we are as well. But I do think there's some reasonable concerns, and the ways in which teachers, sort of the expectations of what we want or should expect teachers to do. Do they have the I guess the training or the expertise to really engage in what can maybe be, some overreach or feeling like, sort of therapy kinds of situations versus, academic teaching. Kind of curious how you think about that sort of landscape.
Yeah, well, we were talking a little bit before the start of the podcast, and I'm aware that SEL is, there's a part of the spectrum that considers it woke, but that's really not what we're talking about. We live our lives through a series of relationships, starting with the relationship that we have with ourselves. And building positive relationships with yourself and with other people is a great way to learn. It's a great way to advance your life, to reach your goals, fulfill your ambitions. And so that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about, and we're also talking about it in terms of being accountable. So we're not saying that kids get away with whatever they want to because they have a social, emotional, or a mental health issue. On the contrary, the way we think of this is if you see a dysregulated passenger on a plane, and we've all seen those clips, it not only interrupts what that person is trying to get done, but none of the other passengers can go anywhere. And that's a little bit like a classroom. And so it is important that children learn how to be regulated and be resilient. But we also know that good people do bad things to kids all the time, and it's not intentional. But they don't understand the behavior that they're seeing, and they don't always understand how to respond to it. And that's where we can step in and be helpful.
Okay. Yeah. So you brought up the idea of SEL being woke, and certainly have seen, and we work with schools on, sort of helping them navigate some of the culture wars, and SEL being one of those things. The sort of accusations of grooming, or whatever those accusations might be, on from that perspective, and it's sort of boring to me at this point, that whole argument. But I guess there's another piece that I think is interesting, insofar as, like, I will see folks, and I don't think this is sort of coming from that perspective of this might be woke or culture war stuff, but like the idea, or maybe it's tangential, but the idea that, or I'll see statements and criticisms of statements of, like, kids' misbehavior is a form of communication, and sort of putting that in an SEL context of how do we respond, and the way that people sort of translate that is some sort of enabling, which you sort of referred to, which I don't think that's necessarily. I suppose it's maybe tangential in some sense to the sort of woke and enablement and that kind of thing. But do you hear that kind of I guess criticism, or people push back on your work from that perspective?
No, that we have not experienced that. There's a great cartoon, I think it's a New Yorker cartoon, that puts it into perspective for me. And my colleague, Dr. Stephen Buddy, showed it to me the first day I arrived at JPA. And it shows two women on a sofa in a living room, and behind them is one of their little boys up on a ladder with a mask on, a face mask on, with a blowtorch, and he's writing on the wall, "I need love." And the mom says to her friend, "Oh, he's just doing that for attention." And it's funny, but it's also really sad, because in fact, when kids are misbehaving, they very often are looking for attention from the one person that perhaps they can trust, and that might be their teacher. That's not always the case. I mean, I'm a mom. I know kids misbehave. We all understand that dynamic. Not getting your way is not the same thing as having an underlying issue that is making life difficult for you. So I think that, I haven't heard anything about grooming, but that's an interesting comment. But when we're working with teachers, and we work with hundreds of teachers and thousands of kids, that is not what we're hearing. What we're hearing is, I understand the importance of social emotional development. Again, I use the word development, not learning, because it's more than just a cognitive thing, but I don't know how to do it. And so part of what we're trying to help educators do is, how do you incorporate these practices into your daily routines in a way that, if you're regulated, your classroom's more likely to be regulated too. And then everybody can get on to the business of learning, which we know how important that is.
Yeah. Is there a sort of framework or foundational, set? Do you use the Castle framework or something different?
No, we don't use Castle. We're familiar with it. There are elements of what we do that can clearly be applied to Castle. We're working with one foundation that's helping us expand our work in C2K, and they use some Castle models, and we've been able to map that against the evaluation tools that we use. But what we have is a set of practices all built around mindsets, and mindsets include such things as behavior is communication. Being able to translate that is important, but also understanding how important it is to that child that that educator in the classroom in that moment understands who they are to the best of their ability and treats them with respect, and that has to be mutual. So we have a set of what I like to call structured, not scripted. So it's not a manualized approach, and it is consultative. And so we work with teachers sometimes in groups and sometimes individually, and typically for a year, sometimes longer, depending on what the principal and the teachers want. And we meet every single week, because this is a little bit like driver's ed. You can study the book, pass the test, get an A. It does not mean you know how to drive a car. And so what we're doing is, we're not only sharing these mindsets, but we're sharing practical strategies, interventions, we're doing some training, we're listening to them, and then in the moment when things are working or aren't working well, we can be on the ground to help support improvement or development. And that's proven to be very, very effective.
So you talked about the behaviors communication, which is something that I brought up. And I'm imagining, if I can play devil's advocate here for a moment, that the response there from that crowd that is very critical of that, like behavior is communication kind of mindset, might raise their hackles, and I think what their objection is, or what their concern is that there is perhaps an enablement or a lack of accountability. And I know you mentioned, that it's not that, but when we're in a classroom, there are, different ways to think about how you manage a group of people in a classroom and manage that process. And I do, personally, I think that thinking through at the very least, the metacognitive identification of how one is feeling and identifying one's thoughts in terms of an SEL sort of perspective or process is really, really valuable for a number of reasons. But I can hear those people saying, yeah, but you're giving permission for misbehavior or enabling or allowing those kids to maybe act out because, well, they've got underlying conditions and that's affecting all of the other students in the room, and that's not fair, and you should really sort of be a bit more quote unquote in control of the classroom and say that's a behavior, here's a consequence, and let's deal with that quickly, swiftly, and move along, removing that student if need be. So how do you respond to those kinds of, I guess, criticism, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, well, criticism is okay. People have strong thoughts and feelings about a lot of things. Remember, I run a therapy agency, and so we're used to hearing all kinds of things. I guess part of what I would ask, and this is what we have seen some of these thoughts from different educators from time to time, but when you really dig underneath it, there are a couple of things happening. Oftentimes there's a fear that if this child isn't behaving, the world is a hard place, and this kid's got to learn how to get along. They have to learn how to follow instructions and behave in the classroom. Mm-hmm. That's true. It's also true that the other kids can't learn because I'm frustrated. I have to stop every couple of minutes and discipline this kid. Mm-hmm. That's not going to improve a lot. And it can have real damage on the child if we don't kind of dig under that. Now, I want to share this story with you because to me, it's part of the reason why I'm so passionate about the work that we're doing in Connect to Kids. And this happened to a very good friend of mine whose son was a bright kid, but struggled all the time in school, just didn't fit in somehow, and was in a school for gifted kids, and that didn't really work out, and they moved him to a public school, and the parents asked that the student be tested. He was, and the school came back and said, this kid's fine, but he's an only child. And so that's really the fundamental underlying problem. So he gets all the way into fourth grade, and one day he's tapping his pencil, tap, tap, tap. It can be very annoying. And the teacher turns around and tells him to stop tapping the pencil. The kid's compliant. He stops doing that, but he starts rolling it instead. She loses it and points to the child, makes him stand up in class, asks the class, does this boy belong here? And sends this kid crying off to the principals to be punished. So there are consequences, right? Mm-hmm. Here's what happens, though. The parents finally got a diagnosis and find out the kid's on the spectrum, find out that the kid has ADHD. The classroom that he's in has things hanging from the ceiling. It's very active. It's the kind of place that maybe you or I would have loved. But this little boy found it totally overwhelming. And when the parent went back and told the teacher was mortified. And here's what the teacher said. Teacher said, that little boy reminded me of my own son. And I am frustrated because I think my son's bright, but he's not working hard enough. And so who was she really upset with that day? She was, yes, upset with a child who was irritating her. But underneath it was her frustration with her own child. Now, the story doesn't end there, though. She was mortified. She apologized to the parent. The only thing I wish is she'd apologized to the kid in front of the class, because what she did was really very harsh. And a year later, though, this woman gets a phone call from the teacher who says, there's a little boy in my classroom who reminds me of your son. Would you mind talking to the parents? And so when I look at something like that, what I see is a teacher making assumptions about what's going on with the kid, the teacher being triggered with her own issues that she's not even aware of in the moment, or maybe not aware until she talks it out with somebody. That once she understands what's really going on for the child and the way the child's struggling, she became much more compassionate towards this little boy. And she didn't forget the lesson, because she called and asked for help. Now, this little boy is now in his 30s, and what the mom told me is a couple of months ago, he started talking about this incident, and she'd never heard him talk about it. And what he said is, Mom, it wasn't just that she humiliated me in front of the whole class, but she gave permission to every other teacher to do the same thing. All these years later, that's the thing about traumatic events. They stick in your head and you just relive them in the moment. All these years later, that incident is still playing out for this man now, this young man. So what I would say is, we're not asking teachers to let kids run wild. We definitely believe that kids who are regulated, who feel valued and heard and all those kinds of things, actually do much better in class. And that benefits everybody. And we have almost 10 years of data that prove that in every kind of environmental, every grade from kindergarten through 8th grade into high school. And as you and I were talking, this has been so successful that a university in Chicago we're bringing it to their faculty as well.
Mm-hmm.
But there's, misperception about letting kids get away with murder. That's not what this is.
Yeah. So then, this is something, a sort of dynamic that comes up in some of the other conversations or debates or arguments or whatever you want to call it. So, for example, there's a pedagogical debate between direct and explicit instruction, more traditional instruction, versus sort of inquiry and constructivism, blah, blah, blah. Won't go into the details there, but one of the things that surfaces in that conversation is, and I think rightfully so in some cases, is, well, because they say, well, there's no evidence for, let's say, inquiry being done well. And say, well, it just hasn't, inquiry being effective. So, well, it just hasn't been done well, or that's the problem, is it just hasn't been done well, which I think has some truth there, but also applies here, I think, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, but applying these sort of procedures and processes in building the culture and helping, getting your classroom better regulated, or whatever language you might use. There's a process there, right? If you're, depending on where you're starting, you're trying to get to that. But in the interim, if you've got a very dysfunctional classroom with very dysfunctional, disruptive students, you've got to bridge that gap, right? So are there, I guess, how do you think and talk with teachers and educators in bridging that gap? Because, I can imagine, yes, I'm trying to enact these kinds of things, these procedures, these processes, and build these relationships and help them understand their emotions and all of these kinds of things. But in the short term, they're, burning the place down, maybe a bit of a hyperbole, but, just to make a point, right? I can recall my youngest daughter being, she really struggled. She was the kid who would say, okay, I'm not going to tap, I'm going to roll the pencil. I said, put your, you're in timeout, put your bottom on the stairs. And she'd say, I'm going to put one butt cheek on the stairs, I'll show you, that kind of thing. And, well, that's not the same thing as a classroom. There's also, like from my perspective, at least as a parent, if I'm telling you to do something, my expectation is you do it. And now we've got a problem. So a long-winded way to ask, sort of how do you talk about or help teachers and educators think through that process of going from, let's say the baseline of 0 to 10, which is ideal. And there's a lot of, I'm assuming, growing pains in the middle there.
Yeah, well, those are great questions, and I'd like to meet your daughter. I like old. girls. But here's my response. 42% of high school kids say they're persistently sad, and they often feel hopeless. Teachers are telling us for the Merrimack Teacher Survey report that 42% of them, their mental health is worse. That's up 42% from last year. We know the teachers are staying in the field maybe 5 years, many teachers. Whatever it is, it's not working. And so one of the things that I'll go back to is this idea that we learn in a relationship with one another. And there's no harm and there's no weakness in showing vulnerability. And if we can find ways to help teachers understand the dynamics in the classroom, and this is what we do every single day with hundreds of teachers, it's remarkable to me that the teachers are feeling more efficacious. So here's what happens in this program. We're meeting with teachers, we're observing the classrooms, and they bring in 3 main topics in consultation. The first would be the kids. And what we found is if they're talking about the same child over and over again, we develop what we call a child support plan. And then at the end of the year, what we've done is we've evaluated those kids that were talked about in consultation using exactly the same evaluation tool that we use in therapy. And we find that those kids are improving at the same rate as kids in therapy, but they haven't had any. So who's changed? Teacher has. Teacher has a greater depth of understanding, has built some additional strategies and interventions that are effective. And for the most part, this really works. We know that teachers, vast majority of them say that, over 90%, my relationship with all the students is better. They're talking about how their stress is coming down. They are talking about how they have more time for instruction. So, I would just invite people, I was going to say challenge, but I would invite people and encourage them to be open-minded and think about how a program like this can get you back to the baseline where teachers can actually teach and kids can be regulated enough to learn. And there's work to be done there because we're not just our brains. We are a bundle of emotions and feelings and spirit as well.
Well, what do you, attribute, or what do you think are the sources of, this seeming, rise in, poor mental health and emotional health? Do you find, some of the narrative around screens and technology, the sort of Jonathan Haidt hypothesis that that the screens and social media especially has really created this? Is it the structure of schools? Is it the parents and their inability or being too permissive, or maybe the opposite? Or what do you find, or what do you attribute those kinds of mental health issues to?
Well, that's a pretty complicated question. I don't know that there's any one answer, but let me just touch on the screen time. I'm not a fan of a lot of screen time, and I know that it's something that kids do. We see it in our practice where, especially for girls, the body shaming, the self-esteem issues are really, really tough and hard to work through. There's outing kids, and we even had very young children taking photographs that were totally inappropriate and sharing them. I think there's a reckoning, and there's a reason the Surgeon General has said that he'd like to slap a warning label on social media. And I can understand why. Much like fire, fire can burn and destroy things, and it can also warm us. I'm not saying get rid of it. I just think we need to be a lot smarter about the way we talk to our children about it and the way we use it as adults. But look at the culture in our country right now. It's so divisive. It's so nasty. It's, if some of the people running for office were in school, we'd send them to the principal because we know there's something wrong for them. Something's not working if they're behaving that way. So there's a large conversation that needs to take place. And I really appreciate your podcast and forums like this, where people can present some different views and we can talk it out, because that's really important, that we understand the motives and the perspectives that are different from our own, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
And we.
Well, one of the things that I've hypothesized about a bit is that some of this might be generational. And, I'm 55, and I would say my parenting style is certainly not a gentle parenting style, but also not authoritarian. I'm, probably more authoritative. But I also don't sort of subscribe to the sort of mindset that that we want to enable sort of victimhood, or like I used to say to my oldest daughter, who would be upset about something that I thought was not particularly, I guess, troubling, don't cry over spilled milk kind of thing. And I would say things like, that's not worth crying over, which may not be the parenting move that some would advocate for, but like, let's make sure we're recognizing what's a really big deal and what's not a really big deal. Because I think in lots of cases, there's at least the accusation or the sense that everything's a big deal, right? Everything's trauma, everything's worth crying over, that kind of thing. And if you look at the mental health, of generations, certainly it's very high with young kids and teenagers, but it's also it's pretty high up until about what would now be, sort of age 50 or so. And then the mental health seems to be, fairly traditional and fairly stable. And one of the things I wonder about is how much of the adult population who are parents now, and I don't know how or why they developed into parents that sort of were a bit more, I guess, gentle or enabling is a strong way to put it, but that they feel so much anxiety about the world and are really struggling to process things in the world. And one, they seem to lack the ability to talk and work with their own children in a way that builds that emotional health and resilience. But that they're also, it seems to me, sort of transferring some of that emotional anxiety to their kids. And I'm wondering if you've seen any of that sort of generational differences and how that looks in your work.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. I think parents have to have their own parenting style that fits them. We were all raised by parents who had particular perspectives because they were raised by their families. And the measure, I think, is the relationship that you have with your daughter. For some kids, being told it's not a big deal is what they might interpret that is, I'm not important enough for you to listen to me. But that's not what I hear you saying. And so you're trying to help her put some perspective and context around her feelings. So I think that's a good thing. I don't know about the generational divide. I think that the world's faster than it used to be. My mom used to like to sit on the front porch with her mother and visit. Everything was face to face. I grew up in that world too. It was a different pace. And today it's very different. I mean, here we are doing something on Zoom with a podcast. And so it all goes back to this idea of what's the relationship we're building with this other person. And if that relationship is built on respect and trust and a level of caring and listening, that relationship is more likely to be positive than negative.
Yeah. So let me, if you'll indulge me for a moment, give you an example. And so my oldest daughter, who's 17 now, was Well, so I was talking with a high school friend, acquaintance, and she was saying how her son was really, really troubled by the war in Ukraine and was literally, her words, sort of unable to or unwilling to go to school or to in school engage in some lesson about, I think it was World War II, maybe in World War One, some major war, and the reason was, according to her, with all of what's going on in Ukraine, it was just too sort of traumatic or troublesome. And I thought, that seems to me to be a really unhealthy way to, or evidence of really emotional unhealthiness. My daughter, the same age, studying the same kinds of things, mildly aware of the war in Ukraine. But as I've always told my daughters, manage your emotions or emotions will manage you. She had no trepidation of studying World War II, other than, it might not be very interesting. That's a different kind of thing. And it really struck me, that sort of difference in how, and it's anecdotal, obviously, but it struck me as a really good example of how a different sort of parenting style, or a parent with a high level of anxiety, might really be struggling to help their own child really navigate some of the obvious. The world is a difficult, as Hobbes would say, nasty, brutish place, and recognizing that there are terrible things happening every day, and will always be the case, and being able to still function and study a world war. So I don't know if that helps, sort of add some meat to the bone there, as I, think about the differences in the ways that we help students, parents and teachers, really, like, how do we process these things that we might think are so traumatic that we are unable to process them in a healthy way?
Yeah. Well, it's such a fascinating story. You said something that the parent was anxious, and I was going to suggest before you got to that there's something going on that probably isn't related to Ukraine and World War II studying.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's where the help of a coach or a therapist can really be helpful to get underneath what's driving that anxiety, because there's something going on that is
seems unusual.
Yeah, it seems a little intensified in a way that maybe shouldn't be. It doesn't mean that social emotional development or therapy is a bad thing. What it means is it can be helpful to untangle all of those feelings and thoughts, get the kid back on track, and help the parent be less anxious. When kids don't feel safe, they act out in lots of really interesting ways that aren't always helpful to adults.
Mm-hmm. Well, one last question on that, and then I want to. I know you have to go, but some of the specifics about your program, and maybe ways in which I don't know how much you're looking to scale it up and that kind of thing. But like I love the idea of Lenore Skenazy and Let Grow, and getting kids to be. We talked about screens, getting them out and playing and interacting and taking chances and risks, and the role of doing that, which is for lots of parents, myself included. I mean, Lenore has become a friend of mine. She's been a podcast guest a couple times, and she urged me to drop my kids off at the grocery store and have them do shopping. And that was, a really great experience for my daughters, really empowering. Those kinds of things. I'm curious how you think about those kinds of programs as just ways to really build some of that resilience.
Well, what's so interesting about that, and I love that example, is that what you were telling your daughters is that you trust them.
Mm-hmm.
You trust them with money, and you trust them to make good decisions. That trust, that belief that a parent has in a child is really powerful. They say that kids don't pay any attention to adults, but I've not found that to be true. The research doesn't support that. I mean, middle school, kids are starting to separate, and there's a useful purpose for that. But kids care very deeply what adults think about them.
Mm-hmm.
And they may not ever admit it, but they do. And so that was a lovely thing that you did for your daughters.
Yeah. Well, and as an extension of that, I feel like, and I think this is a symptom of the adult anxiety issue that I was talking about, is Life 360 or things like that. I think that we're sending a poor message to students, to kids, when we're, putting them under surveillance and thinking about, oh, well, I don't trust you to do. And I do certainly understand, there's some functional purposes, and I don't want to downplay those, of being able to know, oh, they're here and I can plan around that, or my goodness, if they're in a bad place or whatever. But I try to tell my daughters, to your point, like, I trust you, and you're going to make good decisions, and sometimes you'll make bad decisions, and hopefully they're not life-changing, but I have to allow you to demonstrate that you're worthy of that trust until you don't. And I think that Life 360 or things like that are symptoms, and that anxiety. I mean, because that's, to me, what it largely is about. Like, I can tell where my kids are. I can keep track. I know how fast they're driving. Like, my goodness. I mean, you and I obviously didn't have any of that, and I think that's a much healthier. Yeah. Good thing in a number of ways. Yeah.
Well, here's the thing that you didn't say, but I'd ask you about. When you tell your daughters something like that, you might make mistakes, and I'll trust you, until something happens. But my guess is, Drew, that even if they made a mistake, even if they made a bad call, you'd still have their back. And that's what they know.
Sure.
You have a lifeline, a whole life's worth of experience where they can mess up, and you might not like it, but you will always have their back. And that's really what we're trying to get at C2K2, is when teachers have the kids' backs, when we have the teachers' backs, when administration has the backs of their teachers. Teaching is a very stressful, difficult situation today, and we need to do everything that we can. I love what you're doing with your work to support teachers to get in the classroom. We don't know what every kid's going to be when they grow up, but here's what we do know. We need them to be their very best selves, every single kid. And so the work that you're doing and the work that we are doing is with that mutual aim. And that's a wonderful thing to see happening.
Yeah, well, thank you. Just as a wrap up here, because like I said, I know you have to go. You're trying to remain solely in Chicago? Are you trying to scale up, scale out? Do you have partner? Are there other organizations like you in other cities?
I'm sure there must be different approaches that look a little bit like ours, and that's fine. I think what makes our work different from what we've seen out there is that we are mental health specialists. I'm not a trained mental health person, but I run this agency, and so I've done a lot of reading and research, and I am what's called psychologically inclined, according to my colleagues. So here's what we feel. If you know something that helps kids, you're obligated, morally obligated, ethically obligated to share it. We would love to talk with educators and districts about the work that we're doing. There are lots of different ways for us to expand our work, and we'd always welcome a call if we can be helpful.
Okay. Any links or things that you'd like to mention, or things that we haven't talked about?
Yeah, well, we're on, our website is www.jpa.jpachicago.org. And you can read more about our work there. You can see some of our research. We just redid our website, so we're still adding a lot of content there, but you can also find all of our contact information. And we're doing a lot of research. I just hired a new PhD to come and go through I think we have something like 30,000 pieces of information every year on kids. There's a lot to learn there. So we're in the process of learning as well.
Okay. Well, Karen, thanks so much for the conversation. As I always say, I hope folks find it helpful, and we'll put those links in the show notes and go from there.
Thanks so much, Drew. Appreciate meeting you and being on your show.
Thanks.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.